Joining me today on the Capital Talk Show, Michael Shurkin. He's Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Director of Global Programs at 14 North Strategies. You are most welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much for having me.
Do you believe a 21-year-old could have access to such classified info?
Unfortunately, yes. The way our system works is that it often entrusts young people with a lot of, frankly, power. This is true throughout the military, where you have young people who are commanding, operating ships and helicopters and jet fighters, and they have access to computer terminals that have access to a lot of information. So that's not a surprise.
What is the impact of this leaking? Especially, it's about sensitive information. North Korea, Russia.
Sure. Well, the impact, I think, could be very serious. The biggest problem potentially is that, again, I haven't seen the documents, but the documents could reveal sensitive sources, meaning if there really is somebody who's embedded in, I don't know, like say the Russian intelligence service or something like that, and the information that's in those documents enables somebody to figure out who it is, and that person is most likely going to die. And so it's entirely possible that this information could actually lead to the imprisonment or death of individuals. Again, I have not seen the documents, so I don't know, but this is a distinct possibility. Also, what happens is that the information contained might indicate that we have access to certain kinds of information networks, and this might then prompt those countries to do whatever they can in order to ensure that we no longer have access to that information. So as a result, it could blind American intelligence. But then, of course, there's the fact that a lot of countries now get insight into what we think about things. And this can also be very, very destructive because sometimes it's not for the best that people know what we think and know our estimates of what's going on. So, and of course, it could also hurt our relationships with allies, both because it reveals that we might be collecting information on them, but also because it reveals that they're sharing information with us, something that they don't necessarily want the public to know.
In the same area, there was leaks about two spies, Russian spies captive by the United States. They talked about their complot against the USA, UAE. And after that, Secretary Antony Blinken spoke with the UAE Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and they assured and discussed bilateral and regional issues, especially cooperation in all sectors. How do you see this leaks?
Well, it's potentially damaging with the UAE, but on the other hand, it's also the case that the UAE and the United States have a lot of common interests. And so it's really just a question of realism that the interests that the UAE and the United States have in common remain the case. So usually what happens, this is true also with South Korea and with Israel and other countries that are relations with whom might be damaged by the leaks, that what happens is that there's this awkward moment, but then people move on because in the end of the day, those interests that one has in common are important. And I think it's very unusual for a country to sort of say, well, because we're angered by this leak, that we're no longer going to work with the United States. So, Blinken has to do some work to try to make up for the fact and get over the embarrassing moment. But I would be surprised if this were to damage our relationship with the UAE or with any country in particular.
On the other hand, during Iranian Foreign Affairs visit to Moscow in late March, Tehran and Moscow once again reiterated their determination to unveil a new 20-year cooperation agreement. In your opinion, is it transactional or strategic?
Well, we'd have to debate what the difference is between transactional and strategic. I mean, of course, it's strategic for Tehran to build partnerships, right? Because to a large extent, it's shut out of a lot of the world. And so Iran has everything to gain from greater cooperation with Russia. Plus, of course, increasingly, Russia has things to gain from strategic cooperation from Tehran because Russia needs weapons. And these days, actually, Iran has good weapons. So I think for both countries, this is sort of a win-win situation, although it doesn't do much to endear either country with the outside world. So as the United States is quite hostile to Iran, the idea of Russia getting closer to Iran, that's not going to improve our view of the Putin government or Russia. And I think this is true for a lot of countries.
Today, the Department of State of Treasury, are imposing sanctions on more than 120 entities and individuals across more than 20 countries in connection with the Russian Federation unlawful and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, including facilitators of sanctions evasion. How do you see that?
I think that's going to help somewhat, but at this point, I've become very skeptical about the effectiveness of sanctions. I mean, we've had sanctions against Cuba and Iran for decades, and yet those countries are still here. Those governments are still existing and don't show any signs of going away. So while it might help in the short term, at least, because this is all about trying to make it harder for Russia to wage its war, at the same time, I'm skeptical about any kind of long-term effects. There's so many ways to get around sanctions or to them to survive. Plus, I think Russians have this ability to unify in the face of opposition, rightly or wrongly. Whether they're on the right side or the wrong side, they're going to unify against what they see as sort of an outside threat. And I think their ability to sustain economic damage is quite great.
There is a quote that the West have given Ukraine enough to survive, but not enough to win. Do you think this is true? And what about the conflict between United States and Europe, especially France, about the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's true to some extent. The United States, like the rest of Europe, has been afraid of helping helping the Ukrainians too much. The idea is that if we suddenly empower the Ukrainians to have a crushing defeat against the Russians, then this could provoke Russia into escalating the conflict. Remember, Russia is a nuclear power. Russia does have a capacity to do a lot of harm to the world militarily, even if it looks like the military is getting pummeled in Ukraine. And I think that's been the case from the very beginning. We've been very reluctant to really, really open up the faucets and to really help them. So I think there's some truth to criticism, this idea that we've given them just enough to keep them alive, but not enough to help them win. I think there's some truth to that. With respect to Europe, that's a different case. I don't think we're that divided from France as people might think, but I think that Europe at large has not done nearly as much as it could or should in order to help the Ukrainians.
About the role of Russia in the Middle East, especially today, the trade minister of UAE said, we will not jeopardize rules to attract Russian wealth. There was a story about all the money of Russia is coming to Dubai, or they are to avoid the sanctions. So do you see that UAE is more smart than to jeopardize all these rules internationally?
I think UAE is smart enough to play its game well, which means that UAE will be careful, UAE will be subtle. I'm not going to suspect that UAE will 100% enforce all the rules, because I don't think anybody really does. But I think that people who run UAE foreign policy are really very clever, and they're good at walking fine lines. And I expect them to be circumspect and careful. And I think that they will do what they think is best in their interests. And and if that means being tough on Russia or not tough on Russia, I think it's going to depend and move from situation to situation. I see UAE as being a pragmatic country, and that's sort of motivated by sort of practical considerations.
On Saudi Arabia agreement with Iran, it seems like Mohammed bin Salman is trying to be the peace maker in the Middle East, zero conflict, zero stress. I think that China is giving security guarantees to Saudi Arabia, and will this agreement succeed?
It's hard to imagine it succeed given the long-term tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which go back decades. I tend to hold by the view that countries' interests tend to remain the same regardless of who's in charge. And so thus there are sort of long-term adversaries that can have moments of rapprochement, but at the end of the day, or détente, I guess, is the old word from the US and the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, the sources of tension will remain because these are both two countries which have sort of rival claims to dominance or rival claims to legitimacy, and are both trying to influence the region in very different ways. And it's hard to imagine them not stepping on each other's toes. So I don't think any sort of agreement or détente, I don't really see it as long lasting.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the tensions at the border between Lebanon and Israel? Who is responsible, and how do you read that tension?
I frankly see Iran as responsible. I mean, I think that Israel and Lebanon should be friends, and it's just a shame that I think Lebanon all too often has been used as a launching pad for other people to wage the wars against Israel. You know, back in the day it was the PLO, now it's Hezbollah, and the threat to Lebanon, or the threat that Israel poses to Lebanon, is not Lebanon per se, but rather Hezbollah. And so if Hezbollah were somewhere else, that would be the problem. If Hezbollah were to magically go away, which would be a wonderful thing, I think, for Lebanon. I think it would be great for Lebanon, and I think that the any cause for real tensions between Lebanon and Israel would also go away, because other than that, it's a in terms of territorial disputes, it's largely not an issue. You know, Shebla Farms, but this is this tiny, tiny little thing. There are too many reasons why the two countries should have a practical, pragmatic relationship. And, you know, there's the old train that used to run during the British period between from Haifa all the way up. I don't know if it went all the way up to Beirut, but there's a train that's now sort of stopped at the border because the tunnel was, I think, detonated in 48. And so, you know, I don't see why one day that train can't open. The tunnel will be rebuilt, and then, you know, suddenly there are economic ties and there's commercial trade. I entirely blame Hezbollah. I mean, whether or not Lebanon would have one kind of policy or another, if it were not for Hezbollah, is purely hypothetical. We just don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Lebanese government is not a free actor, and to, I think, a large extent, is not entirely sovereign. Maybe in and of itself, they would decide to be very hostile to Israel. I don't know, but again, it's entirely hypothetical. But right now, the problem is Hezbollah.
Do you encourage Syria to join the Arab League? We see leaders in the Middle East trying to understand the position of Assad, and they
Mhm.
are giving his legitimacy again. How do you see this?
I think it'd be a real shame. I mean, Assad has proven himself to be, frankly, a butcher who's killed so many civilians, and it's really hard for me to palate the idea that he would be welcome amongst countries that, you know, in the Arab League, right? He should be anathema to them, or somehow sort of put a ban on him. But I guess reality is, I mean, the other thing too is, like, Syria also has a dependent relationship with Iran, and to a very large extent sort of is subservient to Iran, and sometimes is a proxy to Iran. And I think that's another reason why it would be best if Syria were to somehow not be excluded. But I think it's mainly the fact that Assad has so much blood on his hands. Now, I can't think of any other Arab leader. I mean, it's not comparable to anybody else. I mean, you know, there are governments that do bad things sometimes and can be accused of this, that, or the other thing. But when you're talking about Syria, it's like, you know, the scale is much greater.
Mhm.
And I guess the real shame for this, well, it's a pity for the Syrian people who've suffered so much. And it's also a pity that while the civil war was going on, because of the threat of ISIS and also Al Qaeda, that the outside world was just so profoundly ambivalent about, well, who was the least of the enemies? Like, who is the least of all the evil options here? And I think that's really the only reason why Syria has survived.
Yeah, understood, Michael. I want to ask you about local news. Lately, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg on Tuesday reportedly
Mhm.
represented Jill Jordan to keep him away from interfering in his office criminal case against former GOP President Donald Trump. How do you see the impact is this case and many other cases will prevent President Trump to run again for 2024?
I don't think any of it's going to impede Trump from running if he so wants to. Uh, there are a whole lots of reasons for saying this. For one thing, that it used to be the case where in the past, where when previous people would be caught up in scandal, they would sort of accept, oh, okay, well, there's a scandal, so I'm going to have to step down and not run. Trump seems completely oblivious to that. Like, whether, you know, it's been one scandal after another, I don't think it phases him. more importantly, I don't think it phases the people who support him. The people supporting him will accept anything, whatever comes out, whatever allegation, however true, however awful. I think the people who really support him just love him no matter what. So I don't think this is going to stop anything. And everything's going to be accused of being politicized. We've seen this with the district attorney, with Bragg. I don't know anything about him, but I presume he's a professional. But anything he says or does will be deemed as like this is a political witch hunt. And people who support Trump are going to keep supporting him, and Trump's going to keep doing his thing. So I don't imagine that this is going to stop Trump.
Michael Shurkin, thank you so much for being with me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.